Lena Carter had spent years serving drinks and forced smiles to entitled first-class passengers, but this flight was different. When Bryce Langford, a cocky millionaire used to getting his way, slapped her in front of a stunned cabin, he thought his money would make the problem disappear. He was dead wrong. What Bryce didn't know was that Lena had powerful connections that would flip his world upside down. Before this flight landed, his life, reputation, and power would spiral out of control. But the real shock, Lena wasn't just here to punish him. She was about to change the entire airline industry forever. Before we take off, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe, because tomorrow I've got a special surprise you won't want to miss. The hum of the aircraft filled the cabin as passengers settled into their plush first-class seats, sipping complimentary champagne and scrolling through their phones. Lena Carter adjusted her uniform, took a deep breath, and plastered on the same polite smile she had mastered over years of dealing with entitled travelers. The flight from New York to London was fully booked, and she knew exactly what that meant. Long hours of catering to people who saw her as nothing more than a servant in the sky. Just as she turned to check on a passenger's drink request, a sharp voice cut through the cabin. "Are you kidding me? You expect me to sit in this seat?" Lena closed her eyes for a brief moment, already recognizing the tone. Entitlement, arrogance, another one. She turned and spotted him immediately. A tall man in a tailored navy suit, dark sunglasses still on, despite being indoors, and a scowl carved deep into his sharp features. Bryce Langford. She had seen his type before, the kind of man who had never been told no in his life, the kind who believed wealth excused cruelty. As he tossed his designer duffel into the overhead bin with unnecessary force, he scanned the seat. "Assignment," with visible disgust. "There better be an upgrade available," he snapped at a passing flight attendant. "This is unacceptable." Lena sighed inwardly, but approached with practiced calm. "Mr. Langford, is there something I can assist you with?" He didn't even look at her. "Yeah, get me a better seat. This isn't up to my standards." She kept her voice steady. "I'm afraid first class is fully booked, but we'll ensure you have everything you need for a comfortable flight." Bryce scoffed. "Comfortable? Do you know who I am?" He finally turned toward her, pulling off his sunglasses, revealing cold blue, eyes filled with impatience. "I could buy this whole damn airline if I wanted to." Lena had heard this speech before, maybe not word for word, but close enough. She kept her smile professional. "I understand, sir. Would you like a drink while we finish boarding?" Bryce exhaled sharply, but before he could answer, his phone buzzed. He lifted a finger, silencing her as if she were a nuisance rather than a human being. As he spoke into the phone, his voice oozed fake charm, laughing at something she was certain wasn't funny. Lena turned away, refocusing on the other passengers. Some people whispered about Bryce, some ignored him, and a few looked at her with sympathy. It didn't matter. This was just another shift, another difficult traveler, another flight she would forget once her feet were back on solid ground, or at least that's what she thought. Because this flight, this man, and the choices that would unfold in the next few hours would change her life forever. As the aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude, Lena moved through the first-class cabin with the kind of efficiency that came from years of repetition. She balanced a silver tray in one hand, gracefully delivering drinks and gourmet meals to passengers who barely acknowledged her existence. It was just another flight, another long shift where she was expected to serve with a smile, no matter how she was treated. Bryce Langford had already made himself known as the most difficult passenger on board. He had sent back his meal twice, complained about the temperature, and loudly bragged about his latest business acquisition to the unfortunate soul seated next to him. Every interaction with him was a test of patience, but when he waved his empty glass at Lena with 2 fingers, she took a steadying breath and approached. "Another whiskey, neat," he ordered, without looking up from his phone. Lena nodded, but before she could turn, she noticed the 2 empty glasses already at his seat. "Mr. Langford, per airline policy, we have a limit on alcohol consumption for passenger safety. I can get you a non-alcoholic beverage if you'd like." His head snapped up. Excuse me? She kept her tone calm, professional. We're required to monitor alcohol intake for all passengers, sir. I can offer you a sparkling water. Like she had just told a joke at his expense. You think you can refuse me? Do you have any idea who you're talking to? He leaned back in his seat, shaking his head with an exaggerated chuckle. This is ridiculous. I apologize, sir, but these are the regulations, Lena replied, still polite but firm. His expression darkened, and the laughter vanished. In an instant, his face twisted into something ugly. You're nothing but a waitress in the sky. And you think you have the right to tell me what I can and can't do? A hush settled over the nearby passengers. The man sitting next to Bryce subtly adjusted his posture, pretending not to notice, while a woman across the aisle stiffened, eyes darting between them. Lena remained steady. I understand you're frustrated, but I'm only following policy. If you need anything else... Before she could finish, he slapped her. The crack of the impact silenced the entire section. The sting shot through Lena's cheek, but the shock hit harder. She didn't move, barely registering the way passengers turned in disbelief, some gasping, others frozen in place. A few rows back, someone whispered, "Did he just..." One of Lena's colleagues rushed forward, eyes wide with horror. "Lena, are you okay?" But she wasn't listening. She was staring at Bryce, at the smug, unbothered expression on his face as he leaned back into his seat like nothing had happened. "Maybe next time you'll know your place," he sneered. The plane hummed around them, but all Lena could hear was the blood roaring in her ears. She exhaled. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Lena didn't move. She didn't flinch. The sting of Bryce Langford's slap burned against her skin, but she kept her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. Around her, the air in first class had shifted, an invisible tension pressing down on everyone. The wealthy businessman sitting across the aisle lowered his glass. A woman near the window let out a hushed, horrified gasp, but no one spoke. No one intervened. Bryce stretched his arm out along the seat, exhaling like he'd simply swatted away an annoying fly. "That's what I thought," he muttered, his voice laced with smugness. Lena's fingers curled at her sides. Years of training told her to de-escalate, to walk away, to report the incident through the proper channels. But deep inside, something simmered, a heat that she had buried beneath years of forced politeness, of swallowing disrespect, of knowing that flight attendants were expected to smile through anything. Not this time. She took a slow breath, her voice steady as she spoke. "Captain, this is Flight Attendant Carter. I need to report an incident in first class. Immediate response required." Bryce's smirk faltered just slightly. He had expected silence. He had expected compliance. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom in her earpiece. "Understood, Lena. Security will be waiting upon landing." Bryce chuckled, shaking his head as if the situation were nothing more than an inconvenience. "You're seriously making a scene over this? Do you really think anything's going to happen to me?" He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping, low enough that only she could hear. "Money fixes everything, sweetheart." Lena didn't react, didn't let him see even a flicker of the rage bubbling beneath her skin. She turned to her fellow crew member, who was still standing beside her in stunned silence. "Continue service. I'll be back." She stepped away, heading toward the galley as murmurs spread through first class. A few passengers pulled out their phones, recording the aftermath. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to get involved. Bryce simply rolled his eyes and took a slow sip of his drink, utterly convinced that none of this would matter. Inside the galley, Lena braced herself against the counter, forcing her breathing to steady. The intercom crackled again. "Lena," the captain's voice came through, quieter this time. "We've already contacted corporate. There's someone waiting to speak with you upon landing." Lena frowned. "Corporate? What do you mean?" Pause. Then the captain's voice carried a new weight, something unreadable. "It's coming from the very top." Her heart kicked against her ribs. "Evelyn?" "Yeah," the captain confirmed. "And she doesn't sound happy." Lena exhaled sharply. The CEO, the woman who built the airline from the ground up, the woman who had personally mentored her, who had once told her that no one mistreated her employees without consequences. Bryce Langford had no idea what was coming. Lena straightened, smoothed her uniform, and stepped back into the cabin. She glanced at Bryce, his arrogance touched down at Heathrow. The tension inside the first-class cabin reached its peak. Lena had remained professional, moving through the final descent procedures like clockwork, but she felt every second stretch unbearably long. Bryce Langford, oblivious to the storm about to crash down on him, leaned back in his seat with the smug confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences. As the plane taxied to the gate, a voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated as we complete our arrival procedures." The words were routine, but the energy in the air was anything but. From her position near the galley, Lena caught a glimpse of the security team. Waiting just beyond the jet bridge, 2 uniformed airport police officers and a sharply dressed man holding a sleek leather folder. Corporate security. Bryce had no idea. Lena's fellow crew members avoided eye contact, some nervous, some silently, cheering her on. She felt her heartbeat steady as she positioned herself near the exit, prepared for whatever came next. The moment the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers began to move. But before Bryce could even stand, the 2 officers stepped into the cabin. "Mr. Langford," one of the officers spoke, his voice clipped and professional. "Please remain seated." Bryce blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What?" He gave a lazy chuckle, waving them off. "Look, I have a connection to catch. I don't have time for whatever this is." The second officer wasn't amused. "You're being detained for questioning regarding an incident during this flight." Bryce scoffed. "Oh, for God's sake, this is ridiculous." He turned to Lena, his expression twisted with incredulity. "You seriously called the cops over that? What, you want a pity party?" Lena didn't answer. She didn't have to. One of the passengers in the back of first class, an older woman in an expensive grey suit, suddenly lifted her phone. "Actually, I think they're here because the entire internet has seen what you did." Bryce's eyes flickered with something Lena hadn't seen before, uncertainty. "You might want to check your notifications, buddy," another passenger muttered. The second officer stepped forward. "Sir, we need you to come with us. Now." Bryce's face flushed red as he glanced around, realizing that people were watching, recording, whispering. For the first time, the weight of reality seemed to press on him. "This is insane," he muttered, but this time there was no laughter in his voice. As he was escorted off the plane, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, and Lena caught a glimpse of the notification on his lock screen before he quickly tilted it away. "Missed call. Evelyn Sterling." Lena turned away, suppressing the smirk that threatened to surface, because that was the call that would end him. Lena stepped off the aircraft and into Heathrow's sleek terminal, her posture stiff but composed. She had faced difficult passengers before, but nothing had ever escalated to this level. Even now, as she walked toward the airline's executive lounge where she had been summoned, she could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Security had taken Bryce Langford away the moment they stepped onto British soil. He had been livid, threatening legal action, screaming about how he would own this airline by the time he was done. But his voice had started to crack under the weight of what was happening. His phone had kept buzzing, calls from lawyers, public relations teams, and most notably, Evelyn Sterling. That was what unsettled Lena the most. Evelyn didn't make personal calls. She was the kind of CEO who operated from the shadows, running her empire with an iron grip, but rarely getting involved in individual conflicts. The fact that she had called Bryce directly and had now summoned Lena meant only one thing. This wasn't just about one bad passenger. This was about setting a precedent. Lena pushed open the glass doors of the executive lounge, where 2 security guards nodded and stepped aside. Inside, seated at a private table near the floor-to-ceiling windows, was Evelyn Sterling herself. The older woman radiated power in a way that was effortless. Dressed in a tailored black suit, her silver hair neatly swept back, she barely looked up as Lena approached. But Lena knew better. Evelyn saw everything, every detail, every shift in power. She had built this airline from the ground up, and she protected what was hers. "Lena," Evelyn finally said, gesturing to the seat across from her. "Sit." Lena obeyed, smoothing out her uniform as she settled in. Evelyn let a moment of silence stretch between them before speaking again. "Tell me exactly what happened." Lena kept her voice steady, recounting the events of the flight in precise detail. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The truth was damning exhaled through her nose, slow and deliberate. "I watched the video," she said. "It's everywhere now." Lena swallowed. "I didn't know it was being recorded." Evelyn's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "That's the only reason he's panicking. If it weren't for those recordings, he'd already be planning how to bury you under a mountain of legal threats." Lena held her gaze. "And now," Evelyn leaned forward slightly, "now, I make an example out of him." Lena blinked. "You're not settling." Evelyn's eyes darkened. "Settling would mean I tolerate this, and I don't." A slow, quiet realization settled over Lena. This wasn't just about Bryce anymore. This was about burning down the entire system that let men like him believe they were untouchable. Lena sat back in her chair, letting Evelyn's words settle over her. "Now, I make an example out of him." It was a declaration, a promise, and a warning all at once. Bryce Langford had picked the wrong airline, the wrong flight, and most importantly, the wrong flight attendant to humiliate. Evelyn took a sip from the espresso cup in front of her, her expression unreadable. "Bryce has already activated his damage control team," she said. "His PR firm is spinning the story, claiming he was misunderstood and that the incident was exaggerated." Lena clenched her jaw. "There's video proof. He put his hands on me in front of an entire first-class cabin." Evelyn's lips twitched in a humorless smirk. "Men like him don't care about proof. They care about perception. He's hoping the public gets bored before it escalates." She placed her cup down with a soft clink. "He doesn't realize that this isn't going away." Lena inhaled sharply, something stirring inside her. "What's going to happen to him?" Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "The question is, what's going to happen to you?" Lena frowned. "Me?" Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "I don't just want Bryce Langford held accountable. I want to change how this industry treats its employees." Lena's breath caught in her throat. Evelyn continued, her voice smooth but commanding. "Do you know how many complaints flight attendants file every year? How many cases of harassment, assault, and abuse never get resolved? You and I both know the truth. Airlines protect their profits, not their people." Lena nodded, her stomach twisting. She had lost count of the number of times she had seen passengers scream at crew members, throw drinks, grab wrists, and make threats. And each time the airline's response had been polite apologies and hush-hush settlements. "I want that to end," Evelyn said, her voice turning colder. "And I want you to help me do it." Lena's eyes widened. "What?" Evelyn leaned back, studying her. "I'm offering you a position, head of crew affairs. You'll oversee policies, ensure employee safety, and most importantly, enforce consequences when someone like Bryce Langford thinks they can get away with this." Lena felt the air shift. She had spent years being ignored, enduring mistreatment. With a fake smile. Now Evelyn Sterling was giving her the power to fight back, but power came with consequences. Evelyn must have sensed her hesitation. "This won't be easy," she warned. "You'll have enemies, executives who don't want things to change, VIP clients who'll see you as a threat. They will fight back." Lena met her gaze, heart pounding. "I'm done being polite," she said. "I accept." Evelyn's smirk returned, this time with satisfaction. "Good," she said, "because the war starts now." Lena had barely stepped foot into her hotel room when her phone buzzed with an incoming message. She pulled it out, expecting an update from Evelyn, but instead she saw an unknown number flashing across the screen. "Walk away, or this gets worse." Her pulse spiked. She stared at the message, the weight of the words sinking in. It didn't take a genius to figure out where this was coming from. Bryce Langford, or someone working for him. Lena clenched her jaw. He was panicking. He was desperate. Good. She placed her phone on the nightstand, forcing herself to take a deep breath. She wouldn't let him scare her. Not now. Not when she had just gained the power to fight back, but the tension in her gut remained. She had accepted Evelyn's offer, but now reality was setting in. She wasn't just some flight attendant who had been assaulted by a rich passenger anymore. She was a target. Shaking off the unease, she changed out of her uniform, splashed cold water on her face, and tried to push the message out of her mind. She had bigger things to focus on. The next morning, she arrived at the airline's London headquarters, where a high-profile meeting had been called. The company's top executives sat around a sleek glass conference table, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, looking as poised as ever, while Lena stood beside her, aware that she was being sized. A sharp-dressed man with graying hair leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "So, let me get this straight. You're promoting a flight attendant, someone with no corporate experience, to an executive-level position." Evelyn barely glanced at him. "Yes." Murmurs rippled across the table. Lena held her ground. Another executive, a woman in a tailored navy blazer, narrowed her eyes. "And what exactly qualifies her for this role?" Evelyn smiled coolly. "She spent years on the front lines. She knows exactly what our crews endure. That's more experience than any of you have." Lena didn't miss the way several executives stiffened at the jab. The gray-haired man scoffed. "Let's be honest. This is about optics. A viral incident happens, and suddenly you make a grand gesture to appease the public." Evelyn's smile didn't falter. "This is about change, and change is coming whether you like it or not." Lena's phone buzzed in her pocket. Ignoring it, she kept her expression unreadable, but a gnawing feeling twisted in her gut. As the meeting continued, one thought burned in her mind. They weren't just resisting change, they were willing to fight dirty to stop it. Lena walked out of the boardroom with her head high, but inside she was burning. The resistance from the executives wasn't surprising, but the way they dismissed her, like she was nothing more than an inconvenient publicity stunt, only fueled her determination. They didn't want change, they wanted control. Her phone buzzed again, another unknown number. She hesitated before opening the message. "Check the news, hope you like the spotlight." A cold weight settled in her stomach. She tapped the notification, and a headline flashed across the screen. "Newly promoted airline executive has a controversial past. Is she fit for the role?" Her blood ran cold. She clicked on the article, her pulse hammering as she skimmed the contents. Lena Carter, the flight attendant at the center of the Bryce Langford scandal, has been fast-tracked into an executive role at Sterling Airlines. But sources reveal she has a history of problematic behavior, multiple customer complaints, and a past altercation with a passenger years ago that resulted in a temporary suspension. Is she truly the hero she claims to be, or is this just another PR stunt gone wrong? Lena's stomach twisted. The altercation they were referring to had happened 4 years ago. A drunk passenger had grabbed her wrist and tried to pull her onto his lap. She had yanked away and spilled a drink on him in the process. He had filed a complaint. The airline had written her up instead of him. She had nearly quit that day. Her grip tightened on her phone. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had leaked this. A sharp voice pulled her out of her thoughts. "Do you get it now?" Lena turned to see one of the executives from the meeting, the gray-haired man who had scoffed at her appointment. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching her reaction like a predator watching prey. "This is how the game works," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "You think you can waltz in here and change the rules? This industry doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people who built it." Lena's heart pounded, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Walk away now, and maybe this goes away. Stay, and it'll only get worse." Lena met his gaze, unflinching. "You're afraid," she said quietly. His eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't be trying to tear me down if you weren't afraid of what I can do." The corner of his mouth twitched, but there was no humor in it. "Suit yourself." He turned and walked away, leaving Lena standing there, her phone still gripped tightly in her hand. She exhaled slowly. They wanted to break her, but they had just made a mistake, because now she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was going to burn their entire corrupt system to the ground. Lena stepped into Evelyn's office, shutting the door behind her with more force than necessary. The older woman barely looked up from the reports on her desk, but Lena knew she had already seen the headlines. "They're coming after me," Lena said, her voice steady despite the fire burning in her chest. Evelyn finally lifted her gaze. "Of course they are!" Lena slammed her phone onto the desk, the screen still glowing with the article that had dredged up her past. "They leaked this. Someone in that boardroom. They're trying to force me out." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, studying her for a moment. "And what do you want to do about it?" Lena hesitated. A part of her wanted to fight back, to expose them the way they were trying to expose her, but she wasn't stupid. The moment she got defensive, they would twist it into proof that she was too emotional, too inexperienced, too unstable to be in power. "I want to win," Lena said. A slow smile crept onto Evelyn's desk. Lena picked it up and flipped it open. Inside were emails, reports, and internal complaints, years of evidence detailing abuse, harassment, and cover-ups. Lena's stomach turned as she scanned the pages. Flight attendants being silenced after reporting inappropriate behavior from VIP passengers. Employees threatened with termination for speaking out. Executives manipulating records to bury incidents that would hurt the company's relationships with their wealthiest clients. "How long have you had this?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn folded her hands. "A while. And you didn't act on it." Evelyn's expression darkened. "You don't fight a war without knowing exactly when to strike." She tapped the folder. This is a weapon, and now, thanks to them coming after you, we have the perfect excuse to use it." Lena understood immediately. The executives thought they could destroy her by digging up her past, but in doing so, they had given her the perfect opportunity to expose them. She closed the folder, gripping it tightly. "What's the plan?" Evelyn's smile returned, sharper this time. "Simple. We don't play defense. We go on the attack." Lena felt the shift. The moment everything changed. They weren't just fighting back anymore, they were taking over. And the first step? Burning the old system to the ground. The press conference was scheduled within 24 hours. Evelyn had pulled every string, making sure the media would be there, cameras rolling, microphones primed. The board members thought they had trapped Lena in a scandal, but they had underestimated just how much dirt was buried beneath their own feet. Lena stood backstage, gripping the edges of the folder. The weight of it wasn't just in the papers, it was in what it represented. Years of silence, fear, systemic abuse. And now she was about to blow it wide open. She took a breath, steadying herself as Evelyn appeared beside her. The CEO was as calm as ever, but there was something in her eyes, satisfaction. The thrill of watching a well-executed move play out. "You're ready," Evelyn said, not as a question, but as a fact. Lena nodded. "Let's end this." The moment they stepped onto the stage, flashes erupted from cameras. Journalists murmured among themselves, some clearly eager for a scandal, others waiting for a corporate PR spin. Evelyn took the podium first, her voice smooth and commanding. "Good morning. I'll keep this brief." She glanced at the crowd, letting the silence stretch. In the last week, a great deal of attention has been placed on one incident, one passenger, one flight attendant. But what we're here to discuss today is something much, much bigger. The journalists leaned in. This wasn't what they had been expecting. Evelyn gestured to Lena. "Miss Carter." Lena stepped forward. If her hands were shaking, she didn't. Let it show. She held up the folder for the cameras to see. For years, flight attendants, pilots, and staff members have been harassed, assaulted, and mistreated by entitled passengers who believe money makes them untouchable. Worse, many of these incidents were covered up by this very company. A ripple of shock passed through the room. Lena placed the folder down on the podium, flipping it open. Here are just a few of the cases that never made it to the public. A crew member who was fired after reporting sexual harassment from a high-profile executive. A pilot who was disciplined for refusing to let an intoxicated VIP into the cockpit. Dozens of attendants silenced because the airline prioritized its wealthiest customers over its own employees. The murmurs turned into a roar. Journalists scrambled to take notes, cameras zooming in on the documents. Lena locked eyes with the press. I was attacked on that flight, but I'm not here to talk about what happened to me. I'm here because this happens all the time, and today it ends. Evelyn stepped back up, her voice razor sharp. Effective immediately, Sterling Airlines is enforcing new policies. Any passenger who harasses or assaults an employee will be permanently banned. And as for the executives responsible for covering this up, she looked directly at the cameras. They won't be executives much longer. The press exploded. Lena exhaled. They had just changed everything. The fallout was immediate. Within hours of the press conference, headlines dominated every major news outlet. Airline whistleblower exposes systemic abuse. Executives under fire blared across news tickers, while social media erupted in a frenzy of support, outrage, and corporate damage control. Sterling Airlines shareholders were in full panic mode. Stock prices wavered as public scrutiny intensified. But Evelyn had anticipated this. She wasn't here to preserve the old guard, she was here to dismantle it. And the first casualty? The very people who had tried to destroy 5 executives had resigned. Officially, they cited personal reasons and the need to focus on family. But everyone knew the truth. Their severance packages were shredded, and their careers were effectively over. Lena sat in Evelyn's office as the final reports rolled in, exhaustion and satisfaction mixing inside her like a strange cocktail. It wasn't over yet. There would be lawsuits, counterattacks, desperate attempts to rewrite the narrative, but the hardest part was done. They had exposed the truth. Evelyn placed a glass of scotch on the desk in front of Lena and leaned against the edge of her desk. "Drink." Lena raised an eyebrow but took the glass, the burn of the alcohol grounding her. "I still can't believe it happened this fast." Evelyn smirked. "That's because they weren't ready for a fight. They thought they could outmaneuver me." She tilted her own glass slightly. "They were wrong." Lena exhaled, setting her drink down. "And Bryce?" Evelyn's smirk deepened. "Oh, he's in freefall." She turned her laptop around, revealing a live feed of a news broadcast. Bryce Langford's face filled the screen, his usual arrogance replaced with something far less composed. His PR team had forced him into an interview, clearly hoping to spin the narrative. "I was unfairly targeted," he insisted, his voice tight. "This was a misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by people who have an agenda." The anchor raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Langford, do you deny hitting Miss Carter?" Bryce's jaw tightened. "It wasn't. Look, people get emotional. Things happen. It's being handled." "Handled?" the anchor repeated. "Because as of this morning, Sterling Airlines has permanently banned you from all their flights." Lena's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. Bryce blinked, clearly thrown off. "Excuse me?" the anchor continued, flipping through her notes. "It's not just Sterling. 3 other major airlines have blacklisted you. Your company's investors are pulling out, and your board has called for an emergency vote regarding your future as CEO." Bryce looked pale. Lena watched as realization sank into his face. The power he had always relied on to shield him, gone. She leaned back, letting the moment settle in. For the first time, Bryce Langford had no way out. 1 month later, Lena boarded a plane, but this time she wasn't wearing a flight attendant's uniform. She adjusted the strap of her carry-on and made her way to her seat, feeling the shift in energy as passengers passed by. Some whispered, recognizing her from the news. Others offered small smiles, quiet acknowledgments of what she had done. She wasn't just another crew member anymore. She was the woman who had changed everything. She settled in. She glanced at the in-flight magazine tucked into the seat pocket. The cover story? The industry revolution, how one airline changed the rules forever. It was surreal. Sterling Airlines had followed through on its promises. The passenger misconduct policy had been rewritten, creating a strict zero-tolerance rule for harassment and abuse. New training programs had been launched, educating employees on how to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Flight attendants everywhere were speaking up, sharing their own stories, demanding better protections in their workplaces. But the most significant change, other airlines had been forced to follow suit. No one had expected it. Competitors had initially mocked Sterling's public reckoning, But once the public sided with Lena, they had no choice but to adjust their policies or risk the same level of scrutiny. Lena had started a domino effect. She stared out the window as the plane taxied, thinking of the people who had tried to silence her, break her, push her out. The executives who had resigned in disgrace. Bryce Langford, whose empire had crumbled overnight. His investors had ousted him. His name had become a liability, a cautionary tale. And yet, none of it felt as satisfying as she had imagined. Because this fight had never just been about revenge. It had been about making things right. A voice broke her thoughts. "Miss Carter?" Lena turned, meeting the eyes of a young flight attendant standing beside her seat. The woman hesitated, then smiled nervously. "I wanted to say thank you for everything you've done. We all talk about it, you know, how things feel different now. Better." Lena felt warmth spread through her chest. She nodded. "That means a lot." The attendant smiled, then continued down the aisle. As the plane lifted into the sky, Lena closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. She wasn't the same woman who had stepped onto that flight a month ago, bracing for another shift full of entitled passengers and quiet humiliation. She had power now, a voice, a purpose, and this was just the beginning.